The world has caught a virus, so I've written you
a poem. We need your help to cure it, so stay the fuck at home. And if you have got 12 kids or you're living on your own, lock it down and isolate and stay the fuck at home. If you think you're not at risk here, you're living in a dome. It spreads faster than a hooker's leg, so stay the fuck at home. I need the gym, I need the beach, I hear you bitch and moan. You need to grow a brain cell and stay the fuck at home. But I feel fine, I don't feel sick. I'll go out on my own. How thick are you, you selfish prick? Please just stay the fuck at home. From LA through to Berlin, from Wuhan through to Rome, there's people dying every day, so stay the fuck at home. If you need to contact family, use Facebook, Skype, or phone. We've got the fucking internet, so stay the fuck at home. The only way to slow it down is isolate, not roam. Please help the world get back on track and stay the fuck at home. Stay the fuck at home, stay the fuck at home. Don't you be a fucking dick, please stay the fuck at home.
Well, that was interesting. Welcome to the October 29th edition of Going Viral, Going Raw.news. My name is Jim Dingeman. I'm joined on the air with Alex Stavropoulos, Victor Wallis, Ken Aaron, Dennis Goldstein. That was a little bit of South Park, and Gail Aronow with us tonight. I hadn't heard that intro at all yet, so that was a little bit of a fun thing to do. But let's talk about the unfun things of the day. We still have the debate going on in terms of the Bring Back America, or Buy Back America, whatever the hell it is now, whittled down from $6 trillion to 1.5 or 1.75 trillion. And they haven't received any, it looks like there's not going to be a reconciliation of the divisions soon. So we'll see what happens next week in Glasgow with this kind of situation going on. But I wanted to ask Alex if he had something to share on this particular topic right away.
Yes, I do. I have David Sirota going on the Hill to lambast the Democrats for, well, quote, their abandonment of the working class and middle class voters, which he says they will pay for in 2022. So we can play that. Oh, let me, is this set up to share? Okay, yeah, so I will. Let me play this in full screen.
Biden's social spending bill is taking shape as negotiations continue to whittle the price tag down further and further. Dems have so far said no to a billionaire tax, drug price controls, and free community college. Despite major public support among constituents for the programs, Senate Democrats have also recently decided to drop paid family leave and medical leave from the spending package as well. David Sirota analyzes the policy failures in a new piece for Rolling Stone and condemns Democrats backpedaling on their promises to American families and workers. Bernie Sanders recently said if Democrats fail to pass a real agenda that helps people more and more, people are going to drift towards conspiracy theories, authoritarianism, and even violence. David notes that if history shows any sign, Senator Sanders is right. This piece is published in conjunction with the launch of Meltdown, a new 8-episode Audible series that's out now. Founder of the Daily Poster, David Sirota, joins us to discuss his piece and new podcast series, Meltdown, further. David, congrats on the podcast and welcome to Rising.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Before we knock these guys around relentlessly, I did want to talk about one piece of good, interesting news that came out. There's been this fight mostly between the Center for American Progress and its kind of wonkish DC allies and Matt Bruning, who runs an independent progressive policy think tank over the child care bill. Bruning has been saying that the way that you're designing this child care subsidy bill is garbage, and it's going to leave a lot of middle-class people actually unable to find quality child care, and if they can find it, it'll be at a much higher price, and because of the way you've written the bill, they won't be able to get subsidies. You're going to make their lives actively worse in a devastating way. Cap was pushing back against him, saying, fake news, you're a liar. Basically, this is not true. They've now renegotiated the bill, apparently taken into his concerns into consideration, and now, as long as you're making up to 250% of the median state income. So, so people in New Jersey will get a little bit more subsidy than people in West Virginia. Then you're covered then with a little kind of a graduated cliff after that. So it addresses the problem he said they had created. What was your reaction to watching this unfold? That the Democratic establishment wants kind of lying their way through it, and then in the end, them fixing the bill to his specifications.
Well, I think that is certainly a good development that that Bruning's criticism was implemented, or at least taken into account in the White House proposal. I think it speaks to something larger, that you definitely in the Democratic establishment in Washington, among think tanks, among congressional staffers and the like, there is, you call it a wonkishness, and that wonkishness often translates into complexity. That complexity is apparently perceived as smarts in policy circles in the Democratic Party. And I think that what we've learned over and over again is that when you make programs so complex, means testing, work requirements, and the like, what ends up happening is you end up burdening people with all sorts of paperwork and red tape. You make it harder to access benefits. And perhaps maybe that's actually the unstated point, that you're actually trying to make benefits harder to access rather than simplified. And I think out there in the country, a lot of people are sick and tired of being burdened by that red tape when the government is offering any kind of meager benefit. I think it was Dave Dayen way back many years ago in the New Republic who said that Americans face a huge tax on their time. That there are so many loopholes and so much red tape and so many hoops to jump through just to get access to the basic services of government. And I think this was an example, that back and forth is an example, and it's good to see that the White House apparently took into consideration those concerns.
So what's your argument? I hope you can expand on this for us. That not delivering some of these promises, if they don't make it into what eventually gets passed, that is going to harm democracy. What's the argument there?
Sure, and this is the argument at the core of the Rolling Stone essay and the core of the podcast series that we reported out over the last 16 months, which is to say that when a party asks voters to give it power, to put it into office, and it says, in exchange for your vote, we will provide X, Y, and Z to materially improve your lives, economically. And then that party gets into power and decides to side with its corporate donors and not deliver on those promises, then the meta message that is being sent to voters is your vote doesn't actually matter. So that when the party then goes to those voters in the next election and says, well, at least elect us to defend democracy, many voters can end up saying, look, I just used democracy to put you in power. And you said you were going to deliver on these campaign promises, and I don't feel like you've delivered on those promises. I don't feel like my life has materially improved. So that is the link between economic policy, campaign promises, and democracy.
Won't Democratic insiders just say, we wanted to deliver you these things, but you didn't vote for enough of us, and so you have to vote more of us into office so that we have a high enough margin to actually do the things we said we would do and we want to do?
Sure. I mean, that's the strategy. There's always a fundraising email, always a promise that the change that we promised in the last election is just over the horizon from the next election. I think one of the big lessons out of the Obama era, 2009, 2010, which our podcast series hones in on, is that they had 59 or at one point 60 Senate votes, and they ultimately decided to pass a massive and fortify a massive bailout to the financial industry. I mean, that was started in the Bush administration. It was preserved and protected by the Obama administration and directed. This is a key point. That bailout was directed to financial institutions, not really to millions of people who were struggling. They had 60 Senate votes. They pared back their stimulus bill. They gutted their own Wall Street reform bill. I could give you the litany. But the point is that I believe that voters rightly say the party in power is responsible for what the government is doing. If the party in power cannot deliver on its campaign promises or refuses to deliver on its campaign promises, then voters are going to continue voting for change.
And so Bernie Sanders has actually talked explicitly about this in the last couple of days with regard to the drug price negotiation provision, which Democrats ran on in 2006 when they took the House. In 2018, they encouraged all of their candidates running for Congress to focus on lowering prescription drug prices rather than Medicare for all. They said that's what polls better, promised lower prescription drug prices. They ran again on it in 2020. And what Sanders has been saying is, and this is almost a direct quote, he said, why do we have elections? Like, if 80+% of the country agrees with this, if we've run on this as our top issue, if we've been elected on it, and then we don't do it, he said, quote, why are we holding elections? Why are we asking people to come out and vote and participate in the political process if we can't deliver on this? And I'm wondering from your podcast, what links you identified from the 2008-2009 period and the failure to deliver after that, and the rise of anger and authoritarianism that we've seen since then?
Sure. I mean, I think some of the big ones are Obama promised, for instance, to reform bankruptcy laws to allow the judges to write down people's mortgages so that they could be kept in their homes. Right now, that's still not allowed, and he ended up essentially allowing, and some Congress people argue joining them in gutting that proposal. There was Obama saying he was going to hold bankers who created the crisis accountable. Not one banker was prosecuted. There was a push to break up the banks, to at least get their size under control. The Obama administration threw in to kill that. There was Obama saying we're going to directly help homeowners. The homeowner assistance programs were crumbs, and they were terribly crafted, and they really didn't deliver much help to homeowners. The point in remembering all this is it's not just ancient history, it's to remember what happened after. They got shellacked in the Tea Party election. They got shellacked by Donald Trump. And it was Steve Bannon who said that the legacy of the financial crisis is Donald Trump. And the way I interpret that is that the legacy of the Democrats' response, they're throwing in with their Wall Street donors, the legacy of that part of the financial crisis was the thing that allowed Donald Trump to portray himself as the guy who was going to drain the swamp. And the point in remembering that now is to remember that if Democrats repeat that history, they should expect the other part of the history to repeat as well, either with Trump or a Trump clone in the next election.
David, thanks for talking with us today. We really appreciate it.
And the podcast is called Meltdown, and you have to get it on Audible. Is it Audible exclusive?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you, Alex. Let me just unshare for a second. I'm going to play the news hour, then we're going to talk about this. This is the beginning of the news hour tonight, dealing with where we're at with all this as Mr. Biden goes to Europe.
President Biden is in Rome after a day of high-profile meetings with the Pope and Nick Schifrin has our report.
Today in the Eternal City, the U.S. sought to make sure its oldest alliance would endure. President Biden and French President Emmanuel Macron tried to mend a relationship that's been strained since the U.S. excluded France from a deal to provide Australia nuclear submarines. Today, President Biden delivered a mea culpa.
What happened was, to use an English phrase, what we did was clumsy. It was not done with a lot of grace. France is an extremely valued partner.
President Macron seemed ready to move on.
For me, what's important is that we built during the past weeks some very concrete actions in order to strengthen the partnership.
Those actions include additional U.S. drones and other military support for French troops fighting militants in Western Africa, and endorsing increased European military capacity and industry.
You are the most significant warrior for peace I've ever met.
Earlier in the day, two of the world's most prominent Catholics discussed climate change, poverty, and COVID. President Biden and Pope Francis exchanged gifts, including a coin that President Biden said his late son, Beau, would have wanted the Pope to have. In public, the two emphasized their agreements and avoid discussing the ongoing debate inside the church over abortion. President Biden supports abortion rights. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops says that should exclude the president from receiving communion. After meeting Italy's prime minister, President Biden claimed the Pope provided his blessing.
No, we didn't. He came up and just talked about the fact that he was happy I was a good Catholic.
Tomorrow, President Biden begins the first of two major international summits, including on climate change. Away from all the pleasantries, palm pressing, and photo ops, back home, the president's climate agenda and much of his international clout along with it hangs in the balance. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
In the day's other news, the food...
All right, so Mr. Biden is in Europe. We had Sirota, of course, was a speechwriter for Bernie Sanders and gave a interesting analysis. We could critique it, but let's coming out of that. I'm going to go to Victor. Victor, are you there? He'd unmute Victor.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, Victor, we have the juxtaposition of foreign policy and domestic policy crashing into each other rather vividly in the next week or so. I mean, it's always interactive, but it'll be rather stark with what's going on in Glasgow. And what's your assessment of the way this whole budget issue is playing out? What do you think?
Well, just my impression is that there's a complete deadlock. I mean, that these two recalcitrant Democrats are going to prevent anything from happening. I don't know what can bring them back into the fold. They haven't. They seem to be so absolutely wedded to their base of support, of financial support. So, I mean, that's just my guess. It's an impression. I hope I'm wrong. Even though, as it now stands, they've already exacted a tremendous amount of damage compared to the original project. So that doesn't look good. And I mean, it's certainly in terms of anything that Biden can bring into the international climate summit, it doesn't look very promising.
Right. Alex, what do you think?
Well, I'm in large agreement with Sirota. I mean, and again, I agree with him that if this is where the Build Back Better bill winds up, it's going to be a question how big a margin do the Republicans take back the Congress by, and that will mean again Biden will not only will Biden probably not be able to do anything, but I think then we could return to the bad centrist Biden, where we know that under Obama, Biden was trying to basically privatize Social Security as part of the grand bargain. And unfortunately, the Tea Party Republicans were so crazy that they didn't take that deal. So I think if that happens again, I think, like other centrist Democrats, Biden's going to show that, a centrist Democrat can do things far a Republican president can never do, and things that are very bad for ordinary Americans. So I'm not positive, and this is what I expected from Joe Biden and why I didn't vote for him.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, okay. So here's a piece in the Washington Post today at 5:00. And they're talking about they're in the middle of this $1.7 trillion debate. It's a huge bill, 1,700 pages. And the issue of policy ultimatums not being issued so far, although we see the Progressive Caucus in the Congress has basically put their foot down and are preventing they're saying you cannot exclude the things that you're excluding. And of course, we have Sinema and Manchin doing what they've been doing. I understand that their donations from corporate interests have increased. I mean, this is a fact. It wasn't like something idly speculating. And this is something here like they've thrown out the Sinema in particular was opposing lower drug prices for seniors on Medicare, which seems to be stymied. And here we have this the question of all these different wings of the Democratic Party. Now, part of it, as I look on it, is that these are a reflection of the kind of politics that have evolved, particularly since Clinton, with the sort of centrist. Remember, Clinton was the person who decided to out-Republican the Republicans in the latter stages of his second administration, and he also was someone who was a great advocate of NAFTA, although we should go back to Reagan bringing it in. And in terms of losing, I think Sirota, this is always my problem sometimes with these analyses. They don't do, I mean, there's a lot of it I agree with, there's a lot I don't agree with, because they're not going deep enough in the alienation, the deep alienation of many Americans for the whole political process in general, which has been going back a good 50 or 60 years and just eroding. So sometimes when we're in a state like this, I sometimes wonder, this gets into the kind of issues that Dennis always raises about this revolutionary moment. The loss of legitimacy is so intense that, we're in a situation where dynamics politically that we may not even anticipate. Of course, this growth of neo-fascism in our country, which is now, just entrenching itself and morphing as we speak, can sort of interject itself and tilt the balance in one way or another. But Dennis, what is your opinion about where we're at right now with all this?
Well, I agree with a little bit of everything that everybody said. I think the last thing that you said about you agreeing with me, there is a deep alienation. It doesn't mean that people are necessarily ready to rebel en masse, but there's a deep alienation. I mean, if there wasn't a deep alienation, what would happen is that people would tolerate a couple of election cycles and vote in the Democrats. But what I think people don't trust is that if they go all out for the Democrats and get them elected, that they're going to necessarily get policies and programs that are for the people. People don't believe them. That's what I think.
Yeah. Well, this is something interesting here. We've seen throughout this entire budget process these lengthy battles over taxation. Here we see this one was the latest one that they put forth, taxing a minimum 15% on many profitable companies. But then we have these analyses. Wasn't aware that the Wharton School is actually doing serious macroeconomic analysis of all these things. I usually go to the Congressional Budget Office for that. And this is interesting that they say the Democrats' plans may only raise $1.5 trillion over 10 years, a gap of about $500 billion. And we know that there's been tremendous opposition to essentially tax the super rich. But Gail, what do you think about all this stuff? Gail?
Well, yeah. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
I think there's just chaos all around. I don't think the pandemic has helped any of this. And I think, like it or not, Trump did a lot of damage in the US. But it's also playing off, whatever Rupert Murdoch wants to throw across the airwaves. I mean, there's so much spouting of idiotic concepts that I don't know how you can expect somebody who doesn't, who's not a policy wonk to even know what they think. I don't think, there's a vast expansion of inattention and just general malaise. I mean, that's kind of a redundant concept, I guess, but I don't see it just as the fault of somebody like Joe Biden. I mean, I just don't get that. I think there's problems from A to Z. I mean, the thing that really struck me on that piece you were just playing, Jim, was Biden visiting the Pope, that card they put up at the end there, where it said that Democratic Catholics have like a 90% approval of the Pope, but Republican Catholics don't like him so much. And that pretty much wraps it up to me. It used to be, if you were Catholic, at least this is my impression, if you were Catholic, You loved the Pope. The Pope was terribly important. He was a big authority for you no matter what. Now they're even questioning that authority. So if that poll is accurate, I don't know, just the total breakdown of any sort of authority and trust is just remarkable to me.
Well, this one here in particular, there's been a lot of debate because when I think about David's critique about the Democrats, I think of all the times I've been to events at the Brookings Institution or other think tanks in Washington, and sometimes followed their prescriptions on domestic policy issues. And yes, indeed, it is sometimes something that is detached from what the average American can understand because they want a simple, direct impact on their life that makes their life better. I go back to the kind of alienation I used to hear when I was doing organizing in a factory in the early 70s. And, I'd hear some Wallis supporter tell me, I'm sick and tired of these guys cheating me, taking money away from my ability to, feed my family. What are they going to do for me? And, when you strip all the racist bullshit out of there, there's a lot of truth to that. And I think that, what's interesting to me about these issues of family leave, I mean, we know that most societies in Europe, due to social democracy, have family leave, 12 weeks aid to workers who become sick, etc. And look at what they had to water it down to 4 weeks, and then who knows how it's going to go. Now it's been eliminated completely from the Thursday blueprint, as it says, because of Manchin raising these concerns. So it's interesting to see this. What I guess Biden's going to try to sell is the second rendition of the New Deal gets sabotaged by the contradictions within the body politic as expressed in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Ken Aaron, what's your opinion about all this stuff?
Okay. The major improvement I've seen in the Biden administration over the last 3 to 4 months is he's doing a much better job reading the teleprompter, and he's had less goofs on that. That's about it. The other thing about it is this Build Back Better thing is the only thing that I'm seeing in the press is, what do I get out of it? What does Joe Blow get out of it, Joe Public? And there's nothing in the current legislation that has to do with national interest or national programs, like Eisenhower building highways, like China trying to restore the Silk Road and the Pearl Road, the lakes, like projects I've seen about growing a section through Northern Africa to green Northern Africa to make it fertile again and grow trees. Or, something national, something that benefits, like putting in electric charging along the roads. Elon Musk just sold 100,000 cars to Hertz. And that's great, but that means those Hertz rental stations are going to have superchargers in them. So that's going to add to the existing network. Elon Musk has also put up 1,000 satellites to create a satellite internet all over the world. What is the US government doing aside from in the public face, politically saying, oh, I'm going to give you more money, I'm going to give you this benefit, you get that for free, this for free, here's for you, here's for your cousins, oh, and here's for these poor people, handout, 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 nanny state. I don't hear anything about we're going to eliminate all of the Superfund toxic sites. We're going to clean up this lake. We're going to get rid of lead in the water. We're going to guarantee this or that. We're going to decommission every abandoned nuclear plant. We're working on thorium. We're working on better reactors. What is the national plan besides, hey, I got some money in my pocket? Well, not yet, but I'll get it from somewhere. Let me give you something on credit and I'll get the money later. It's a sham. And I'm not talking about Democrats or Republicans. It's just, it's ridiculous. It's like a minstrel show. All right, well, I'm going to give you this and I'm going to give you that. Wait a minute. Let's hear the other side. I'm going to give you twice as much as the other guy promised. As I used to say, the way to get in an office is to say, all men will go from 6 inches to 8 inches, all women will lose 20 pounds, and everybody gets 3 chickens in a pot. You just get up there and promise them everything. But nothing has been stated on, and it's very interesting, on a national level. It might go up to family interests, community college for your children. And it might go at about that. Maybe, I'm surprised nobody has offered free burial benefits. That's the one thing they haven't been willing to discuss. I guess it's too morbid or it's not politically correct. But everything else, we're going to cover your stay in the hospital and pre-kindergarten care and everything from birth all through life. And but they haven't given you yet free burial. So, but again, it's not a national program. I haven't heard that yet. And the one thing which I would hope maybe you fellas here could educate me on, I tried looking it up, I couldn't find it. What policy changes are being proposed in this Build Back Better bill? I hear handouts and funding, and we're going to do this and Medicare. It's all benefits for individuals and families. But what policy changes? Like 32-hour work week, or like enforcing some like a real Theodore Franklin Delano Roosevelt programs. We're hiring people to work in the national forests, to cut paths, fire roads, to cut down on the horrendous numbers of extreme fires, which is usually due to the electric cables, the cable companies and the power lines. And what remedial preventative action can be taken. We're going to ramp up the national forest corps to protect ourselves from environmental things. We're having a contest for who can build the best dam around New York City. And we're going to get ready for the floods that are coming. Where's the national? These guys are nationals. They should be thinking larger than Joe Schmo is getting evicted. Let's give him some money. It's ridiculous. And just handling problems and not, waiting for the next calamity to happen. And then the government will be there to give you a handout. No, let's look at potential hazards and start working to avoid them or mediate them. Dams, dikes, evacuation plans, relocations, eliminating. Why do we keep letting people build properties every time they get wiped out every 5 years along the lower coastal line or in valleys? And it happens in California a lot. First the valley burns, houses burn, then no trees, so the floods come and the mud. Why do we let people keep building things in places where they shouldn't be building? So what policies are in the Build Back Better? I couldn't find any.
Well, it's an interesting question you raised, because I was talking to somebody who worked in communications, corporate communications, her entire career last week. And the one thing, and she's been a dyed-in-the-wool, she's gone out and supported Sanders. She did all those kind of things. She goes back to McGovern. And the very fact that you're raising these things points out the fact that, yes, indeed, when you read these policy statements that they have evolved, they do indeed address those things, but they've not communicated them in a simple, meaningful way to the average American so that they understand that this will have an impact, good or bad. And then, of course, we get into wider questions about the contradictions of this stage of capitalism and where it's at in terms of how it can perform or not perform. But anyway, let me move on to the next story I want to deal with, and that is China. Let's deal with Julian Assange, because, Alex, did you want to play a piece on Julian Assange before we have Victor talk about?
Indeed,
right, so you're listening to Going Viral, goingviral.news. My name is Jim Dingeman. This is the October 29th edition. We have Gail, Aronow, Victor Wallis, Dennis Goldstein, Ken Aaron, and Alex Stavropoulos on. We're now going to talk about Assange. And what is this we're seeing here?
So
Alex?
this is, remember when we were going through the, 2-week extradition trial of him by British court judge Vanessa Baratzer. These were the same guys. We were using them, which again, this is Consortium News. which is, again, one of the few major, well, in this case, independent outlets that actually has given kind of full coverage to the Assange case all the way through. And this is here, you'll see it's the editor-in-chief of Consortium News, Joe Loria, who's used to work, I think it was for the Boston Globe and the Wall Street Journal as a UN correspondent, decades ago, of course. But here he's summarizing what happened this week at the U.S. appeal against the decision by Judge Bracer that Assange should not be extradited because of his mental health issues and the likelihood he would commit suicide in a U.S. jail. So here we go. All right, that's to worry. Yeah, he's okay.
Welcome to CN Live's continuing coverage of the two-day hearing of the U.S. appeal against the decision not to extradite Julian Assange, the imprisoned WikiLeaks editor. I'm Joe Loria, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News. Well, today was the final day of the hearing at the High Court inside the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand in London. And it was a day where we saw a final argument in the last 30 minutes of rebuttal by the U.S. prosecutor, James Lewis, and the entire day was given over to the defense's side for the argument by Assange's two lawyers, Edward Fitzgerald and Mark Summers, about why the decision of Vanessa Baraitser in January not to extradite Assange should be stayed and not overturned. Of course, Baraitser decided not to extradite him because on the grounds of health, that he has severe mental conditions that would cause him to commit suicide, very likely if he spent time in a harsh American jail in solitary confinement. So because those are the two pillars of Baraitser's judgment, everything else in this case, everything else WikiLeaks has ever done, publications, the Espionage Act, all of that took up many, many fascinating weeks of the 4-week hearing in September 2020 that we covered with our daily nightly videos and our reports on Consortium News. None of that matters. It all comes down to those two questions. Is Assange seriously ill? Will he face isolation in an American prison? And that combination, according to Baraitser, who was absolutely no fan of Julian Assange, but she was convinced that he is ill enough that if he was sent at the prospect of being extradited, facing those kinds of conditions and the special administrative measures, even at the Alexandria Detention Center pre-trial, that those isolated sentences could very, very highly likely cause him to commit suicide. Based on that, she decided to discharge him and not extradite him. I just want to mention one point why Baraitser was no fan of Assange. When the Yahoo News story broke, of course, it became the talk of a lot of people, even mainstream media, that the CIA had decided they had planned or had serious discussions to either abduct or assassinate Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London. This was in 2017. That figured very strongly in today's hearing. But I just wanted to make the point about Baraitser that this knowledge of this plot was already in the court in September 2020, because a former partner and a former employee of UC Global, the Spanish security firm that was contracted by the CIA to spy on Assange 24/7, had been hired by the Ecuadorian embassy to protect Assange. These employees anonymously testified that the CIA was discussing assassinating or kidnapping him. What the Yahoo story did was confirm that by talking to many former officials. Baraitser's reaction to that and her ruling to free Julian Assange, based only on the health grounds and the condition of U.S. prisons, was to essentially express sympathy that she didn't know if it was true, but if it were, it was essentially understandable because the U.S. was very concerned about his ongoing activities. So this is the mindset of Vanessa Baraitser. She wasn't too bothered by the idea they may have tried to assassinate Julian Assange in the heart of London, steps from Harrods, on the territory of a foreign nation and their embassy. So the U.S. appeal and their task is to overturn, to convince these two High Court judges, the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, Ian Burnett, and Justice Timothy Holroyd that, in fact, he's not very sick and the American prisons aren't all that bad. And how did the U.S. go about doing that? Well, attacking the testimony yesterday and again today was the defense of this Michael Koppelman, who was the chief medical witness who convinced Vanessa Baraitser that he was seriously ill, and other testimony about the prisons convinced Baraitser that those prisons were very bad and that he should not go to them. So the U.S. has attacked Koppelman. They have tried to say that he's not seriously ill. And when James Lewis, the prosecutor, summed up, he cited 3 witnesses, 1 defense, 2 prosecution witnesses, who said that he was moderately depressed. Now, that he was when he was examined at that moment. And it's kind of ironic because Lewis yesterday said we can't talk about what the future, what he might suffer in the future when he gets extradited, what his mental state is, whether he's suicidal there or not. It's dynamic. He said, so we can't talk about the future, but he talked about the past today, that at one moment he was diagnosed as moderately depressed. So that's the argument they push. He's moderately depressed. And then there comes to the assurances. And this was really the key part of today's testimony. The United States gave assurances to Britain that they would not put him in one of these hellholes, a SAMS, or even an ADC in isolation at all. The Assange lawyer said, too late. You had to say that during the hearing in September. You can't change the case because you lost. Now say, oh yeah, by the way, we're not going to put you in those SAMs. Well, Lewis came back and said that there were instances where a high court even discharged someone, released them. And then the assurances came from a requesting government, and they put the guy back on in an extradition hearing. He also said they could do that to Assange, which was quite chilling to hear him say that. And also that another case was suspended for 2 weeks in order to get together. So he's to get together these assurances. So he's making the argument that it wasn't too late. You can put it in during the hearing or after the hearing. Now, the most dramatic part of the day's testimony was, of course, when Mark Summers, the lawyer for Assange, detailed the CIA's plot to kill him. The Chief Justice Ian Burnett interrupted him and said when he started saying that the relationship between the CIA and Mr. Assange is vast and it's not before the court. Burnett interrupted and said it's not contested that the CIA is intensely interested in Mr. Assange. But then he went on to give all those details of the Yahoo story, and everybody I'm sure is familiar with what they are. They actually discussed killing him. Pompeo said some of it is true. Lewis, when he came to his rebuttal, said absolutely nothing. So the challenges were that the U.S. doesn't accept these assurances. They don't believe they're worth the paper they're written on. They're not worth 2 bob, is what John Shipton, Assange's father, said on one of our webcasts that we broadcast. So the U.S. is saying they don't believe it. They gave examples where they broke their word, but here's Lewis contending that the United States has never broken a promise to Great Britain, ever, and Great Britain has never complained to the U.S. about this. The U.S., Assange's lawyers called this conditional, aspirational. It does say in these assurances that if Assange should do something to threaten national security of the United States, they could throw him back in SAMS again. All through the hearing, we heard that was where he was going to go. That's what Vanessa Baraitser thought. That's why she made the ruling that she did. So to sum this up, Lewis thinks that the message he was saying to these 2 judges is that the 2 pillars of the lower court decision by Baraitser, in his view, were demolished. Assange is not seriously ill, moderately depressed, and he won't be going to a harsh U.S. prison. You have to, one of the judges, I think it was Burnett, said, you have given us much to think about and we'll take time to consider it. And they have got until who knows when. It could take months. They think around December, Christmas time, or maybe early next year, we will get a decision. Will those judges side with the United States that he's not very ill and that they believe the American assurances he won't go to a prison, a harsh prison, and that the sentencing won't be as long as many of Assange's lawyers fear it will? Or will they side with Assange's lawyers and say he is ill, the testimony shows that, and he may or may not go into the, if they're going to be, I find it hard to think that high court judges, establishment figures, Chief Justice of England and Wales will doubt the U.S. word. It might come down more on whether he's really seriously ill or not, but you need both. The combination of terrible, horrible American prisons and Assange's suicidal impulses driven by his mental disorders. So this will be decided by the whole High Court sometime around December. So this is a quick report tonight. I'm going to sign off. This is Joe Loria for Consortium News. We'll be back that night for the decision of the hearing.
All right, Alex. So what's your comment about all this? You got to cut it off. Well, Victor, you were at a teach-in today, basically, were you not?
I participated in a panel on Monday about in Cambridge, Massachusetts, along with Kevin Gostola and Juan Passarelli, who made a very good film called The War on WikiLeaks, which I highly recommend. But my comment on this whole thing is it's the same thing that I could have said at the beginning. It's just so the whole thing is so totally illegal in the sense that any extradition, according to British law, is impossible if it's a political case. And this is so blatantly political, and how the court has succeeded in getting that sort of out of the discussion is scandalous. And I mean, in terms of their logic, I mean, it sounds as though, I mean, they're making it hinge on such arbitrary considerations. It's interesting. I mean, the original decision of Baraitser, I was quite surprised. I think most of us were surprised that she decided that the extradition should be halted, but she couldn't or didn't, or for whatever reason, challenge the basic U.S. case against him, nor did she challenge the fundamental point that any demand for extradition should be invalid if it's a political case. So I don't know what to expect, and I come back to saying it's essentially a similar reaction to what I had in relation to the whole issue of the Build Back Better negotiations. That what's missing now, compared to what existed in the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt, is the scale of the mass movement and the pressure on them to do something. And I think it's probably similar in this case with Julian Assange, that the tremendous potential of public opinion, mass demonstrations, and expressions of protest by all sorts of prestigious groups would ultimately have an impact. So I mean, I still hope, of course, that this will succeed. But I mean, in the terms in which the British authorities have defined the situation or accepted the definition, I'm not optimistic. So that's about all I can say. The one other thing I would add, and this is something that came out of the discussion that we had on Monday, is that in the event that the extradition would not go forward at this point, it might be an opportune moment, even politically, from Biden's own point of view, for the U.S. finally to drop the charges, because I think that there's been so much uproar and so many criticisms in so many quarters of what they're doing, that it would actually be an embarrassment for the United States to have the U.S. In charge of Julian Assange, actually have him directly in their custody. What they would do with him, it would be an embarrassment, no matter what would happen, even if the worst things happen, and especially if the worst things happen to him, it would be a total embarrassment for the United States. So I think that dimension of the issue has to be also taken into account.
And for the purposes of the audience, who were your colleagues on the panel? Could you identify who they were?
Yes, well, the maker of the film, The War on WikiLeaks, whose name is Juan Passarelli, and Kevin Gostola, the journalist, who actually is in London now. Actually, they're both in London now and following the events very closely.
Okay. Alex, what are your feelings or comments about where we're at with this?
Well, you know where they've always been, that he should never have been arrested in the first place. He is a journalist. All this BS about he's a hacker, or he's a threat to national security. He's not a threat to the American national security. Well, certainly not to the security of the American people. He's a threat to the people in power because he exposed and has more than essentially the entire mainstream media has done more than the New York Times, Guardian, all the TV networks, including all the international TV networks, more than any of them. And they've used his reporting to expose war crimes particularly by the United States, but by many U.S. allies, and not just even again by many other countries, including the Russians, that of course has always asserted that Assange is somehow working for. WikiLeaks does a public service for us all, and without it, we would not know what our governments have been doing in the dark of night these past 12 years. I think it started around 2009. So it has, Julian Assange is, as far as I'm concerned, is a hero. And he should not be in jail. He certainly should not be. And furthermore, the Espionage Act is blatantly unconstitutional in all its forms, and because it goes up against the First Amendment. It should never have been, it's passed in the middle of the First World War to basically deal with people who might have tried to stop the draft during the First World War, and was never intended to be used against whistleblowers or journalists. And I think even Woodrow Wilson, again, who was, use it against people like Eugene Debs, but I think he would be shocked to see it used against a journalist. And I don't think that was the intent of the Congress back then either. So I think it's been misused by the national security state to target its enemies. And we would do, what we really should do is Congress should repeal it. Or the Supreme Court should put down a decision that it is blatantly unconstitutional and, throw it out where it deserves to be.
Well, I ain't going to hold my breath on that one.
Oh, no, I agree with you, Jim. But again, if we truly had rule of law in this country, that's what would happen.
It's funny, when the WikiLeaks was issued, I remember all these friends of mine who had top secret clearances, they could not look at WikiLeaks. So one of them asked me to look at WikiLeaks for him. And then another guy who had a top secret security clearance, he said, "To hell with it, I'm going to look at it anyway." And I don't even think the revelations on Afghanistan, because I remember when they released for 4 or 5 years of every single unit's after action report, and nobody exploited that. I mean, I don't remember that being exploited as well as it should be. And I attended an event at a little library where they had all the editors from the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian there. And they were all talking about, because Assange is not exactly Mr. Perfect. And they were all sitting there talking about how difficult it was to work with him and all this. And they tried to distance themselves from him at that time. Whereas now, this latest evolution of everything, the mainstream media initially was sort of rallying to his cause in a sort of feeble way. But right now they seem to have completely pulled back from all this. And it's very interesting because if you sort of talk to the activist journalistic establishment, they're sort of, the ones I know and respect are pretty gung-ho about having him not be incarcerated or having him freed. But the others are sort of always, I don't know what to say about this. I don't know about this or that. And, I think of the story that was broken about SEAL Team 6. I remember when somebody came who was the sources for the Times and the Washington Post, when they actually published that story, that person was the source of that, came to me 4 years before that story was published. And he and I had a long talk about it. And I said to him, you got to get proof. I mentioned what had happened to Peter Arnett with Tailwind with CNN.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
he got burned years ago. And I said, you got to be careful when you go into these kind of things because, where's your proof? Where's your proof? Where are the documents? It's sort of like with Haugen with all the documents. She came in with thousands of pages of documents on Facebook. And, someone like Snowden, and then you look at what happened to Hale with his leaks on the drone program, which The Intercept published, which were remarkable, absolutely remarkable. If one looks at the documents that he leaked, they can give you a really good sense of the innards of how drone warfare is operationalized globally because they were that detailed. No wonder the government went after Hale. So, whatever I may think personally about Assange, in terms of him being, because, I know, what's his name, is always over there in London with Assange, Randy Credico.
Randy, yeah.
Yeah, Randy loves Julian Assange. He's always like, they're all.
He's been holding stand up shows.
Yeah,
For his defense.
Yeah, but the point I think that where I can sort of get beyond all that is the depth of the information on the abuses and corruption of power that basically he just lays out in all the it's absolutely amazing to read what he put out there. And that goes for Snowden, that goes for Hale, that goes for all these whistleblower types that they want to try to repress. So, and of course Biden is a centrist on all this. He's not, I cannot see him pardoning Julian Assange.
No.
But anyway, let me move on to Kenny. Kenny, what is your opinion about the Assange case?
Got unmute.
Sorry, I'm unmuted. Okay. And here's my pretty face. I'll turn that back on too. Come on, there we go. So, well, of course, it's not a question of his personality. It's just a question of what policies you want to implement. It is only one person. Of course, now he has, I read in the press, he has 2 children he had a relationship with his lawyer while he was in England in the Ecuadorian embassy. So he's a family man. So there's consideration about that, although I didn't hear the judge bring that up. What about his poor orphans? If he goes to jail and commits suicide, he'll leave behind 2 orphans. But to listen to that judge, I think it's very sound material for a Monty Python skit. I've never heard anything like that. Never, ever. Well, if he goes to this jail, I hear they serve sweet potato pudding for dessert, and that drives this person crazy. He may commit suicide if we send him to that jail. And that's why we're not going to extradite him, because of a threat of suicide. If the word gets out on that to prisoners, and they would go, let me out. One more day here, I'm going to commit suicide. Threat of suicide is a reason to make a judicial decision on it, not looking at the merits of the case or anything, just suicide. Straight out of Monty Python. That's all it is. Of course, let him go. Come on.
Well,
what is the U.S. doing with it anyhow? And he's in England. He's a citizen of Australia. Come on, give it up. It's like a layer on top of Abu Ghraib. I never forget Donald Rumsfeld saying, if more information gets out about Abu Ghraib, it's going to be very, very bad for this country. That was his justification for continuing to keep it covert. Because if anybody finds out what we really did, boy, we're going to be in trouble. So it's the same thing here.
Well, yeah. Look, I went to when WikiLeaks was given the Polk Award for that Apache helicopter. Basically the Apache helicopter killing the
collateral murder video.
Yeah, basically that whole thing. And and of course I was in the audience watching it, and the average person sitting there doesn't know the sardonic, black, macabre humor of gun pilots who basically were just getting their jollies off killing those people. And it's sort of shocking for the average person to watch that kind of behavior right in front, because that's standard procedure in an air assault unit. People will act like that. They're hunters. They love that kind of behavior. So I was watching a bunch of civilians completely in shock watching that. But that was something that he did that was stark and had an impact on the world, showing that what goes on in Baghdad with our intervention and the war there. So, it just is something that, shows me how powerful what he puts out is in terms of the ability of people to then decide if they're going to use this information to empower themselves or empower everything. Yeah.
But Jim, have you ever heard anything as ridiculous? I mean, I consider it ridiculous that the judge is saying, I'm going to make a ruling because I've been advised that he's a very sensitive person and he may commit suicide because of conditions. Unless they were saying, oh, this jail is famous for suicide. We're sending him the same place we sent Jeffrey Epstein. We seem to have a lot of Epstein.
But see, the background of this, of course, is we have this, we have the revelations in recent weeks about the CIA actually, no surprise, they want to assassinate him.
Yeah.
I can understand that from their point of view.
But she didn't say that. She didn't say.
Oh, I know that, but
dangerous.
That's in the background
it's
of
too
all
dangerous to hand them over to the U.S. Because of their history. She said, he's very touchy. He may commit suicide.
Well, I think there is a possibility of him committing suicide. To be honest with you,
so what? There's I may commit suicide tomorrow.
Yeah,
most suicides are just just a momentary decision to jump off a bridge.
Someone with autism spectrum like Assange is several times more likely than you are to commit suicide. And again, we know from study after study what isolation does to people.
That's right.
And for example,
everybody in isolation, should be released.
How many times did Chelsea Manning? It was like 3 or 4, at least 2 or 3 times that she tried to commit suicide under the same kind of conditions. Yeah. Obviously, again, she had her own psychological issues with transitioning to another gender, and there have been others. In fact, again, one of the cases that they've been talking about with this is there's another British case where they didn't extradite this another hacker, Laurie Love, who also had psychological issues, and that was the reason in that case. So this is based on these precedents in British law, in their extradition cases, where again in other cases because of mental health issues of a defendant, they chose not to extradite them to the United States. Well, so that's where this is.
So I'm ignorant of that. I thought the only influence of legal proceedings is you're unfit to defend yourself.
No,
because
it's not about being unfit. It's about
it always was clear that we wanted to kill him.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no ambiguity about that. The United States wants to kill him.
Well, more people in the military service commit suicide than any that are lost in action or duty.
Well,
that the suicide rate in the U.S. military is very, very high. So, you could say, well, discharge me, give me don't make it a 4F. I want a good discharge and a pension. Because, I'm in the Army, I may commit suicide.
Well, Manning, look, Manning is sitting there watching in her or his at the time. He was in a fusion center, an intelligence fusion center in Iraq.
Yeah.
Where they were basically had access to all the intelligence. Because one of the big things after 9/11 was they figured they had to create fusion centers because one of the lessons they took from 9/11 was because all the intelligence was so fragmented. This is the argument they made. Other people, of course, have other arguments about this, that they couldn't put the whole story together, so they were not going to have that same mistake made. So Manning's sitting there in a fusion center and radicalized himself, watching all this real. He could go dibble and dabble and read all this stuff. That's how Manning came out the other way. But let me hear what Dennis has to say. Dennis, what do you think about Assange right now? Dennis?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
I think Assange is being prosecuted and persecuted for being a real journalist. He was one of the most brilliant journalists. He's one of the most brilliant journalists of our time. That's what I think about him, and they want to shut him down. It's really indicative of the kind of policies the U.S. is ready to to exercise against anybody who goes against them. That's any country, too. It's like, I mean, what they're doing to Venezuela now is terrible. And they have about 40 countries that are under sanctions. And they are willing to do anything to people, including kill them or kill their populations off in order to win. So I think they're vicious. And I think they have to be defeated. And the American people are not up to that. And that's too bad, as far as I'm concerned, because it's a really disgusting situation historically. I'll leave it at that.
All right, Gail.
If I could add something to
Go on, Victor.
just a footnote to what Dennis was saying about the sanctions and the cruelty of it, because that raises directly another current case of extradition with the case of Alex Saab, the Venezuelan diplomat who has now been transported back to the United States and all he was trying to do was to find a way to get through the sanctions, and the U.S. is absolutely bearing down on anyone who's trying to do that. So it's just more of the same, but it's another case that we need to watch closely.
Okay, thank you. And Gail, your thoughts about the Assange situation?
I don't have too many thoughts. I'm trying to remember why he's a journalist, would be my first question. He wasn't to start, right? Can somebody remind me? And the other question I have is, what are you talking about that he's autistic, Alex?
He's on the autism spectrum. He's been diagnosed as having Asperger's syndrome, which means he's on the autism spectrum. DSM-5 or whatever. He's got a psychiatric. He's had a psychiatric diagnosis.
Really interesting as an idea that if you're on the spectrum, you're free of criminal or whatever.
No, it's not free of. I mean, certainly.
Well, I mean, I'm sort of back with what Ken said. I mean, it is kind of questionable by, I guess, American legal standards.
But as for journalism, I mean, WikiLeaks is a journalistic enterprise.
Well, I understand that now, but initially he wasn't really a journalist, or am I wrong? Because I really don't remember, Victor.
The essence of WikiLeaks is to make it possible for sources to disclose information anonymously, and that's a journalistic project. So it is a form of journalism.
I don't remember, but forgive me, I'm not, I understand the WikiLeaks thing, but initially he, with all the leaking stuff he set up WikiLeaks specifically for that, right? But did he have any history as a more ordinary journalist? Or, I mean, everybody's talking about him as a journalist. I just can't remember enough about his biography. Does anybody know that? Where did he come from? Can anybody remind?
Well, he came. Well, who wants to jump in before Victor or Alex? Well, you remember
he was a computer programmer, I think.
He wasn't really a journalist.
He was one of these kids that hacks into the FBI or something.
Yeah, look, his mother, he came from his mom was a radical 60s type in Australia. He was a brilliant kid, completely rebellious. And I've listened to people argue. I mean, I've listened to Pulitzer Prize winners in journalism go back and forth on this issue in public about whether he's a journalist or not. And some of them, will, with a little bit of, begrudging, kind of zeitgeist in their voice, say, "Oh, yeah, I guess you can think he is." But, the fact was that, yes, he was indeed exposing data. I mean, part of it was sort of in the realm of being a citizen journalist, and he's an anarchist. At least he was, as in that period of time, as he's evolving in Australia. And so his attitude was, I'm going to give the information to the world and the people, and they can inform
themselves. He's a believer in radical transparency.
Right.
If you put all the government secrets out there, then the government will be better, basically.
Again, someone like him is not, look, everyone here has been involved with people in movement circles for decades. And a lot of people sometimes in those kind of situations aren't the most, beloved of individuals you're going to come across. They aren't. But certain things you just sort of put aside. It's the work that these guys do or a woman does, and what they're putting out that has a benefit. And in his particular case, my God, he had an impact globally when that data, when the State Department information he put out had impacted countries all over the world because people could read about how corrupt their leaders were. It was quite an amazing revelation. I mean, it was just an overwhelming revelation. Because I remember when I first was reading it, I was coming across this. I said, "Holy cow! Where did he get? How did he get this? Where did he find this?" Well, we of course know how he got it, but it's and then of course Ellsberg leaped to his defense.
Well,
Daniel Ellsberg.
I mean, come
Well,
on.
Well, and then other people like that. So the question becomes, and we're going through the 50th anniversary of the Pentagon Papers just in the past year. So it brings home to you the necessity and the impact of, like, if there is a government is engaging in policies which are pernicious to its own public and the world, it deserves to be exposed. It deserves to be exposed. It deserves to have its ill brought to light, to the people. Now the question is how the people absorb all that. I mean, Trump. Look at Trump with WikiLeaks. He says, "Where's WikiLeaks?" And it's all this, yeah, in 2016. But I would argue it had a tremendous effect, a profound effect, on our politics today. But anyway, I wanted to shift to China because China, of course, next week we're going to have on a person who is an editor of a left-wing Taiwanese journal called New Moon. And what was fascinating to me was the group, the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy. It's a group based in I guess in Boston, actually. They had a teach-in last night where they had a number of scholars talking about the situation, in the present situation. And they had a professor from Bucknell University, another person from this magazine, New Bloom in Taiwan, and Michael Clare. Michael Clare is no mystery to, I'm sure, yeah, Victor, you might have known Michael Clare when you were at Columbia.
I did meet him, yeah. He's done really important work on resources and so on.
Right, and he, of course, when he was at Columbia, he was responsible for the NACLA pamphlet, Who Rules Columbia? I remember that vividly. And Brian Chi Shing Ho of New Bloom, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing these guys' names, Professor Zikun Zhu of Bucknell. But let me just play this because I thought it was pretty good. And the other thing, we were arguing beforehand. I have to say that from the point of view of China, this issue of suppressing a book that just was published in Germany of Xi Jinping, they actually were going to have the authors talk at various China institutes in Germany. And because they were Confucius institutes, in other words, they received money from the PRC put pressure to cancel the talks, which is a pretty stupid move because I even emailed the author. I said, wow, that's a good way to increase your book sales. So, because people are going to react to that. And, and Xi Jinping, they basically did not want this book to be published or publicized about Xi Jinping. So on the PR front, China has done that. And the other thing that's amazing is, as both Alex and I know this, but we've been looking at the Chinese film market. And the largest movie this year to gross in China is a movie about a battle in 1950 where the 1st Marine Division was nearly destroyed by the Chinese up at the Chosin Reservoir. And it's a movie about the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. And it made $850 million. It's the highest grossing film in the world today. So it shows you in a way that, well, that's interesting. A movie in the pandemic that's essentially the Chinese equivalent of going to a Rambo movie or a John Wayne movie, except, of course, the bad guys are the Americans. But in any event, let me just start off this. This is the Bucknell professor talking about this question of, is this the most dangerous situation in the world today? And he is going to be followed by the Taiwanese professor, Chomsky. Noam Chomsky's daughter was the person overseeing this and emceeing it.
In U.S.-China relations and recent developments.
He has a mute.
Thank you, thank you, Professor Chomsky. Thank you all for attending this timely webinar. I think many important questions about China and Taiwan are not publicly discussed in the United States. So I think our webinar tonight or this morning in Taiwan is a step in the right direction. I'm supposed to provide an overview of the US-China-Taiwan relationship in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to just focus on 3 questions. First, how did the United States get involved in Taiwan? The US involvement in Taiwan can be traced back to World War II. We all know that Taiwan was ceded to Japan by the Qing dynasty after the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95. Japan colonized Taiwan for 50 years until 1945. The 1943 Cairo Declaration and the 1945 Potsdam Declaration outlined the terms for Japan's surrender and the return of the Chinese territories it occupied. President Franklin Roosevelt attended the Cairo Conference and President Harry Truman attended the Potsdam Conference. So with the US support, the Republic of China officially celebrated Taiwan's return on October 25th, 1945. Unfortunately, right after World War II, and after the United States failed to mediate between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, the Chinese Civil War resumed. It was clear to American observers at the time that Chiang Kai-shek's forces were losing, and the United States was not going to stop the communist victory. So on October the 1st, 1949, Mao proclaimed the founding of a new China, the People's Republic of China.
That he froze.
Oh, it's.
What happened?
You might want to try clicking on it. It's loading or something. No. You gotta like.
What?
Click on. Just restart it and no. In the bar, click on it and
on the bar.
Bring it up again. Well, bring at the top. No. You wanna open the same file, the same thing again.
File. No. All right, forget it. I'll have to restart.
Yeah, because it's yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah.
All right.
Because obviously it's having trouble loading or something.
Right. All right. Well, anyway, while I'm doing that, Alex, jump in with something. I'll get it set again.
Well, I do. I can play clip from Deutsche Welle about the hypersonic weapon that they just tested. Just a little. Well, I say the guy they bring on is somebody from the military-industrial complex, connected Freedom for Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is a PNAC type. Again, they're funded by the weapons lobby, and so he's not gonna be a fan of China. They're horrible. and they're a threat to all of us, etc. So keep that in mind when you listen to him.
American concerns about the threat posed by China. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has become the first U.S. official to confirm that Beijing has tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic weapon. Speaking to Bloomberg, Milley said, quote, "What we saw was a very significant event of a test of a hypersonic weapon system, and it is very concerning. I don't know if it's quite a Sputnik moment, but I think it is very close to that. So it's a very significant technological event that occurred, or test that occurred, by the Chinese." Well, the Soviet Union's launch of a Sputnik satellite back in 1957 fueled U.S. fears that it was falling behind in the nuclear arms race. The Pentagon did not comment on Milley's remarks, other than to confirm that the U.S. is working on its own hypersonic weapons.
There's a limit to how far we can go speaking publicly about certain capabilities, but it's in the budget. You can read it for yourself. Our own pursuit of hypersonic capabilities is real. It's tangible, and we are absolutely working towards being able to develop that capability.
All right, let's get some insight into the story now. We can speak to Bradley Bowman. He is the Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He's joining us from D.C. Bradley, welcome to our show. General Milley said, "We don't know if this is a Sputnik moment, is it?"
Thanks for the opportunity to join you, and thanks for the question. I would say this is a significant and concerning development that, in my view, underscores the need for the United States to modernize our own nuclear triad. But I do think we need to put it in perspective. I'd say we need to put it in perspective because, one, these capabilities are not entirely new. And two, China already has the means to conduct a massive and successful nuclear attack against the American homeland. So, I can dig into more detail on each of those, but for those two reasons, I think we need to put it in somewhat perspective.
Bradley, let's take a step back. I mean, what are hypersonic weapons?
Yeah, what makes this significant weapon unique is the way it combines different assets. So the way this particular system would work that China just tested is that it would take a large rocket and put a nuclear warhead in orbit. So that's where the term fractional orbital bombardment system comes from. And then at a time of their choosing, they would fire a small motor, which would make it fall out of orbit and then glide towards target. And that last part, glide, is kind of the new thing. And so really, as one expert put it, you can kind of think of this as, imagine an enemy space shuttle with a nuclear weapon on it, but no landing gear, right? So that's essentially what we're talking about. Why would China want this? Well, it provides really about 5 advantages for them. One, they could launch it around the South Pole, and most of our radars and America's radars and sensors are focused on the North Pole. It would come in at a lower arc, which makes it a quicker flight, so it gives Americans less warning time. And the glider can evade our missile defense systems, we'd have less warning for people on the ground, and it would be difficult to intercept because the glider would be maneuvering. So if you combine all these things together, it is a very significant and serious development. But as I said already, they already have enough intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and air-launched cruise missiles to conduct a successful nuclear attack on the American homeland. So, it's not like we're suddenly vulnerable today and we weren't yesterday.
But how widespread beyond the U.S. and China is this technology?
No, this is combining it. So the Soviets experimented with a similar technology during the Cold War. But the glider aspect of this and some of the modern improvements that China's making makes it more formidable. But yeah, no one right now fields a capability quite like it looks like the Chinese are working toward. We have hypersonic missiles of a different nature, but I don't think America needs to match China weapon per weapon on this. Instead, I would recommend really the U.S. does 3 things. We should modernize our nuclear triad, as we're already doing. We should do more space-based missile detection, and we should focus on boost phase intercept. That's the vulnerable initial phase of a rocket as it's heading up into orbit.
You talked about
into space.
Bradley, you talked about China's strategy a little while ago. I mean, China has dismissed General Milley's confirmation, and on Saturday, the Ministry of Affairs had this to say about the use of this technology.
The US is the first country in the world to conduct research and development of hypersonic weapons. It is now still developing and even spreading hypersonic missile technology and investing trillions of dollars to upgrade its nuclear triad force.
So the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry, they're essentially saying the U.S. is already developing this technology. Bradley, are you at all concerned that we are entering into a new arms race?
The Beijing's already racing. I mean, just call a spade a spade. I mean, they are conducting the largest and most ambitious military modernization effort in the history of the People's Republic of China. They are dramatically, the head of our strategic command said that China is, quote, we're seeing a strategic breakout by China, unquote, that he called, quote, breathtaking. They're increasing both the quantity and quality of their ICBMs. You've probably seen the reports about all the new silos that they're building. And the scariest part of this is they're doing it in a very opaque manner, unconstrained by international arms control agreements like the ones we have with Russia. So when we don't know exactly what they're doing, it makes American military planners assume the worst.
You mentioned the arms control treaty with Russia. In the last arms race, the Soviet Union and the U.S. agreed on these treaties as a common goal. I mean, do you think that is the aim of the Biden administration in this new arms race?
I think the aim is to defend the United States and to convince Russia or China that we have the means to defend ourselves so that they would not conduct the attack in the first place. But let's not miss the connection between nuclear modernization and arms control, right? Your adversary is not going to come to the negotiating table unless you're doing something they don't like. So by modernizing our nuclear triad, we defend Americans and make the likelihood of nuclear war less likely. And we also give Beijing and Moscow incentive to come to the negotiating table in good faith.
What is the message China is trying to send the U.S. here?
I think China is trying to, as they say in their own documents, as Xi has said, they're trying to fill the world's preeminent military. They're trying to send a deterrent message. And they're trying to hone the ability to conduct a successful attack, a nuclear attack on the American homeland.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Okay, so sounds to me like once again, they're talking about a missile gap. And we've, well, in retrospect, we've always overhyped, well, in the case of the Soviets, we were always ahead of them. We remained ahead of them. And I still remain, wonder why the U.S. should be afraid of a country that has 1/3 of its defense budget. Shouldn't everybody be afraid of the U.S.'s, overweening military power on that level? If, we exceed pretty much we do exceed every other country, and many of them combined. But I'm sure other people have different thoughts than I do. So I see we have Mike on, so I'm sure Mike will disagree with me. If Mike, you want to unmute? And are you there, Mike?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts about this latest we've discussed our thoughts on how much we think hypersonics are a real threat or not. So maybe you want to bring in some of that. Yeah.
Well, hypersonics are a real threat. I mean, I think that's I think that's not a debatable point. How much of a threat you might want to debate, but they are a threat. Look, if China's, if what he's saying is true, and China is trying to make itself a viable nuclear threat, that's not a good thing. And yeah, I do disagree with you on the fact that I mean, this one you can't really blame on the United States totally. China did not have to build a hypersonic weapon, did not have to have the capability of destroying the United States totally in a nuclear war.
Isn't that mad, Mike? Mutually assured destruction. Yeah.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. In other words, unless China had a reasonable fear that the United States was going to launch a nuclear war, which during the Trump administration, I could possibly see this. But no,
I think like here, like with the Russians, they've been worried about the U.S. efforts to develop missile defense. And again, because China has so many fewer nuclear missiles than the Russians do, they want to make sure they will get through. So we can't conceive of a first strike against China.
Well, missile defense, I think this, when we were talking about back in the day about, ABMs, anti-ballistic missiles, and, systems and things like that, I think that a country being able to prevent nuclear warheads from landing on its soil, or that, I guess in the United States would be the US or Canadian soil. But I don't think that's a bad thing. Yes, I can understand if they're doing it by saying, hey, now we can blow them up and they can't touch us, so let's blow them up. Yeah, but I think in general, I mean, that's a bad thing. But in general, I think every country, every single nuclear power should have an anti-ballistic missile system so that if that were the case, nuclear would be a bad thing.
All right. Well, first of all, Michael, that went out the door a long time ago.
I know.
Basically, if you recall, there was a debate about anti-ballistic missile systems in the early 70s, and and other powers decided to violate because it was looked on as a source of instability. And the Chinese nuclear forces, as they built up, were never designed in the way that they weren't a counterforce nuclear capability. They were not they were basically, they couldn't, in other words, initiate an attack on the United States or respond to a surprise attack, which is what the United States now is reacting to, because they're doubling the amount of silos they have in the western part of China, and they're also further evolving their sea-launched ballistic missile capability. Plus, they have this conventional arms race going on, and that's where you have arms racing going on between the United States and China. Is now, we're well underway. It's well underway right now. We're in the midst of it, and it'll probably get worse. So I've gotten that other piece up, but Victor, I'm wondering, what your thoughts are about all this with China in terms of the arms racing going on. You have to unmute.
Mute, Victor.
This brings back nightmares about the U.S.-Soviet arms race in the earlier part of it. But that, in terms of the U.S. and China, what strikes me especially is that, John Pilger made a film a few years ago called The Coming War with China, which forecast this very well, and pointing out especially the way the U.S. has surrounded China with bases, not to mention all its hundreds of other bases all over the world. So one can understand that China feels under siege. And so I think they're developing this as a deterrent in the same way that the Soviet Union developed its nuclear arsenal as a deterrent to the United States. The United States was always the one that was the aggressor. It was the only country, and this Ellsberg has pointed this out many times, that not only used the atomic bombs when it bombed Japan, but repeatedly used them in the way that one uses a loaded gun to threaten someone in every imaginable instance. And it's continued to do that even now, talking about it in reference to Iran when Trump was pulling out of the Iran treaty. So it's a terrible arms race. No one in high levels is talking about negotiating, coming together, reaching some kind of understanding. The way finally, under enormous public pressure in the United States, the freeze movement in the 1980s, that finally a kind of agreement was reached between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which reduced tensions. And so, something like that is what's desperately needed. Any of this I mean, the ballistic missiles were already enough to destroy everything already. And what more do we need? And the additional expenditure on it, and the astronomical difference between the expenditures on the military and the expenditures in combating the climate crisis is something that everybody should be talking about and should be shocked about. It's about 20 times the amount, at least, spent on the military as on combating the climate crisis. So that's my general reaction to it. I can't get into the details about the technicalities of innovative ways of launching these things, but it just makes it scarier. But I mean, I think the initial fact of the U.S. Having pivoted towards China, and then on top of that, all these campaigns of discrediting China in every way, that this is the point of really the point that needs to be emphasized. I mean, I don't think that. Well, the United States is just threatening continuously and devising all kinds of excuses for an aggressive posture towards China, and it's really alarming. That's my feeling about it.
Right. Well, what I wanted to show here is this is the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Korea. Excuse me, the Republic of China. And what you're seeing in front of you right now, unfortunately, I can't really blow it up that much, but this is the radar plot today of the sorties of the PLAF, the People's Liberation Army Air Force aircraft going in, and that's the air defense identification zone around Taiwan. And this is essentially a 3 aircraft flying as a package. Their terminology for this is, when you send off a mixed group of, at least the U.S. Air Force, that's theirs, a package. So here's a package. Here's Taiwan. And they're flying, they're flying out from the mainland of China and they're skirting back in. So they're essentially coming into the radar systems of the People's Republic, and they're coming back out. And what you'll see, and this is the 2 J-11s, that's a fighter aircraft, the Y-8 is a reconnaissance aircraft. And this is what was going on, goes on every day. Here's on the 28th, the same aircraft configuration, except a little different. This is an anti-submarine warfare aircraft and flying to the southeast of Taiwan, 3 aircraft. This is what happens the day before that, on the 27th, the same pattern. Except they have 2 fighter aircraft and 1 anti-submarine warfare aircraft going out. What that does, of course, is they're basically, they could be dropping, sensors to see what kind of activity is going on as they go out and in. They want to see what perhaps just exercise to see how their ASW capabilities. But again, 3 aircraft. We're not talking about 50, 60, etc. Then here you got a little more. This is on the 26th. So this was a whole variety of aircraft, including a helicopter, cargo aircraft, EWs, and electronic warfare. So they're basically exercising a C-3, all various types of aircraft. And again, to the southeast of Taiwan. Why they have this pattern, I do not know. The next day before that, another. So what you're seeing, of course, is that this is the typical kind of pattern. Again, here's on the 24th, the same kind of flight pattern, in and out, this 1 aircraft, etc. Now, and the hoopla that was made of the large numbers on the 1st of October, and you'll see that in a minute. There's the 20th, 2 aircraft, 5 aircraft on the 19th. And again, what they're not showing is American aircraft going into Chinese airspace, because I'm positive we were going back and forth because we want to test their radars, their electronic war capability. In other words, they want to see the radar configurations, the ability to jam aircraft, etc. But again, this is normal tension between powers, the way they interact with each other. The 16th, 1 aircraft, an anti-submarine warfare aircraft. The 10th, too. And I'm going to go fast forward to what generated all this publicity. On the 5th of October, 1 aircraft, 4 aircraft going in. They came a different flight pattern. And I guess this is where most of the bases are in the mainland. Here's where this is the 4th of October. Here's about 60 aircraft, and they're flying. And these are the different patterns of their flight: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 packages. So that means these aircraft are flying in different ways. This of course is when this great alarm of this was brought up in terms of the press. Then this is the other day. Yeah, let's see. There we go. So that's on the 3rd. And again, you can see most of these aircraft flying in the southeast pattern, southeast of Taiwan. Then here is the 2nd. And again, larger numbers, so 12 aircraft, 18, about 19, 20 aircraft that day. And here is the amount of aircraft who flew on Independence Day. Excuse me. And then there was another flight of aircraft also the same day, except at a different time.
Mm-hmm.
So again, there was a large amount of aircraft exercise. And again, this is, muscle flexing by superpowers. Here's the 1st of October. This is this Independence Day for the mainland. And let's see. Okay, so you can see this is what, about 25 aircraft. And then earlier that day, there was a lot of aircraft that they put up. Here's about 30, 35. And then what happened the day before? Only 1. So I'm not saying it's an anomaly, but what you're seeing is this is what's more typical, this amount of aircraft, as opposed to 50, 60, etc. And of course, we know what was reported in the press. Oh my God, they're acting differently. But again, the press can be easily manipulated when it comes to these kind of issues, because they do not do any research about this and tend to be sloppy in how they report these things to the public. And maybe this guy can be heard. If it doesn't, we're going to move on. I'm not going to linger if he can't be heard.
And President Harry Truman attended the Potsdam Conference. So with the US support, the Republic of China officially celebrated Taiwan's return on October 25th, 1945. Unfortunately, right after World War II, and after the United States failed to mediate between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, the Chinese Civil War resumed. It was clear to American observers at the time that Chiang Kai-shek's forces were losing, and the United States was not going to stop the communist victory. So on October the 1st, 1949, Mao proclaimed the founding of a new China, the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. Chiang Kai-shek's ROC government and about 2 million followers retreated to Taiwan. Mao was prepared to send the People's Liberation Army troops to cross Taiwan Strait to liberate Taiwan, and the US government actually was about to abandon Taiwan. The Korean War broke out on June 25th, 1950, which changed the US strategic calculation and saved Taiwan. President Truman sent the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait, essentially blocking the PRC attempt to take Taiwan. So from 1949 to 1971, Beijing and Taipei engaged in a stiff competition for international recognition of who represented China. The United States continued to support the ROC in Taiwan during that period. The global tide changed or turned in 1971 when the United Nations passed Resolution 2758 to have the PRC replace the ROC as the representative of China. The United States shifted its position too. In July 1971, Henry Kissinger took a secret trip to China, paving the way for President Richard Nixon's historic visit to China the following spring. So in February 1972, during Nixon's visit to China, the two countries issued the Shanghai Communique, in which the United States acknowledges, quote unquote, that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is only but one China, and the United States does not challenge that position. This is the foundation of the so-called One China policy. 1979, the United States and the PRC officially established diplomatic relations. In the 1979 joint communique, the United States reaffirmed its acknowledgement of One China. Now, many members of Congress were furious that Washington cut diplomatic relations with Taipei. So to preserve US relations with Taiwan, Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, and President Jimmy Carter signed it into law in April 1979. The Taiwan Relations Act has guided US unofficial relations with Taiwan since then. On August 17, 1982, during the Reagan administration, the United States and PRC issued a third communique to map out plans to reduce US arms sales to Taiwan. On the same day, the US government privately gave Taiwan 6 assurances, including not setting a date to end arms sales, not consulting with Beijing regarding arms sales, and not exerting pressure on Taiwan to enter into negotiations with the PRC. So this is a very short historical survey of how the United States got involved in Taiwan. Now, my second question, what is the status of Taiwan-China relations? Depending on where you stand, you may have different interpretations of the status quo. The PRC's position or definition of the status quo has been consistent. Beijing believes that the separation of Taiwan from the mainland was caused by the Chinese Civil War. However, China's sovereignty and territorial integrity remain unchanged, and there's only one China, including both the mainland and Taiwan. Beijing also states that Taiwan must be unified with the mainland, ideally by peaceful means, but it has not use of force. Now, Taiwan's position regarding the status quo has been evolving over the years. Both Chiang Kai-shek and his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, followed One China. After Chiang Ching-kuo died in 1988, the Kuomintang, or KMT, under Li Teng-hui, continued to follow One China initially. Now, President Li even set up the National Unification Council in 1990 to outline the 3 stages for national unification. And in 1992, the officials from the 2 sides actually met in Hong Kong, out of which came the term 1992 consensus, basically based on One China agreement. However, in 1999, Li Teng-hui proposed that relations across the Taiwan Strait are special state-to-state relations. The pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, first came to power in 2000. The KMT returned in 2008. The KMT has continued to follow the ROC Constitution and One China. In 2016, the DPP's Tsai Ing-wen was elected, and in 2020, she was re-elected. The DPP's position is that Taiwan is already independent. China and Taiwan do not belong to each other. Now, what's the US position on the status quo? The United States has always opposed unilateral change to the status quo, but the US interpretation of the status quo is vague, very vague. US officials often make a distinction between Beijing's One China principle and America's One China policy. Now, One China principle forces that there's only one China, Taiwan is part of China, and the PRC is the sole legitimate government of all of China. And the United Nations also follows that One China principle. For a long time, America's One China policy is based on the 3 communiques with the PRC and the Taiwan Relations Act. But recently, the Reagan-era 6 assurances to Taiwan has been officially added to the equation by Washington to define its One China policy. So one wonders if this is a change to the status quo. US officials also considers PRC's recent aggressive military activities around Taiwan as a challenge to the status quo. But on the other hand, they do not consider the DPP government's abandoning of One China or the 1992 consensus as change to the status quo. The US has consistently stated that it does not support Taiwan independence and does not follow a policy of one China, one Taiwan, or two Chinas. Then what exactly is Taiwan's status under America's one China policy? It is very vague and confusing, at least to me. Now, finally, my third question. What are the dilemmas in the US-China-Taiwan relationship? I think all the three parties have conflicting interests and goals, which makes peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue extremely difficult. They all face some contradictions or dilemmas. The first, China's dilemmas. The PRC is really worried that Taiwan is slipping further away from China. While Beijing prefers peaceful unification, it has vowed to crush Taiwan independence at all costs. But the more pressure the PRC exerts on Taiwan, the more resentful the Taiwanese people become, and less likely unification will be. For example, China continues to block Taiwan's participation in the World Health Organization as a way to punish the DPP government. But it has alienated many Taiwanese who do not like Beijing's intimidation. China's behavior has ironically consolidated support for the DPP. So how to fight Taiwan independence without alienating the Taiwanese public? This is a real dilemma for Beijing. Now, Taiwan has its own dilemmas or contradictions. For example, the DPP government has categorically rejected Beijing's one China policy, which they think is something Beijing imposes on Taiwan. The DPP government has stated that the two sides should engage in meaningful dialogue based on parity and without one China as the precondition. However, by claiming that Taiwan is already independent or Taiwan and China do not belong to each other, the DPP government actually is imposing its own precondition that Beijing cannot accept. Now, finally, America's dilemmas. The United States will help Taiwan maintain a sufficient self-defense capability based on the Taiwan Relations Act. But the Taiwan Relations Act is not a defense treaty, and the United States is not obligated to defend Taiwan, unlike what some people think here, including sometimes President Biden would think so. So for the United States, how can the United States support Taiwan's democracy without endorsing Taiwanese independence, which will drag the United States into war with China? And how can the United States protect Taiwan's people and way of life without turning Taiwan into a chess piece in the US-China power game?
Wow.
A lot of questions that needs to be discussed. But I think I'm running out of time, and I stop here. Thank you very much.
All right, so they go to the next speaker, and he's quite interesting. And I want to.
You're actually perfect on your time, so thank you very much. That I think is a great background for what we're going to hear next from Brian Chu about the political situation in Taiwan and how groups there are viewing the Taiwan-China relationship. Brian.
Hi, everybody. So thanks for the invite to speak today. And I think it's very important to have discussions like this on these critical issues. So I'm very happy the opportunity to discuss here today. So I'll kind of talk a bit about the Taiwan perspective, what people are thinking and feeling on the ground in Taiwan. A little background on myself. I'm one of the founding editors of New Blue magazine, which was founded after the Sunflower Movement in 2014. That involved the month-long occupation of the Taiwanese legislature by student activists. This was in protest against a trade deal that the then ruling KMT, the Kuomintang, wanted to sign with the Chinese government that allowed for investment in Taiwan service sector industry. It's fear that this would be affecting of Taiwan's political freedoms at a time in which media organizations, for example, had begun to self-censor because of influences from the Chinese market or being bought up by pro-China capitalists, more or less. And so particularly in the news headlines, one had seen just the historic flybys by Chinese warplanes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. This increased to new heights never before seen. Just 150 planes in the 5 days between October 1st and October 5th, from when Chinese National Day is commemorated to 5 days after. 5 days before when ROC National Day is commemorated. And then these kind of Chinese military threats that have increased to new levels. For example, Chinese warplanes now intrude into Taiwan's ADIZ to sometimes on a near daily basis, depending on the timing. And just 150 planes, there were 680 planes in the last year. So that's like close to 25% or so, 20% within just 5 days. And it's probable that this pattern of escalation will continue. And what one sees oftentimes is tit for tat escalation between the US and China. So one group does something and the other side does another thing, and this continues in that sense. So for example, after October 1st, Chinese National Day, on that weekend, there were naval exercises conducted between the US, two US carrier groups, a UK carrier group, Japanese war ship. Then after that, just 2 days later on October 3rd or 4th, I can't remember, then the UK carrier group moves across the Luzon Strait to carry joint exercises with the Singaporean Navy. The dangerous thing is that both sides perceive themselves as only responding to the other side, and this allows for this pattern of mutual escalation. And then Taiwan is stuck in between. And so it's one of those interesting things. I think for a lot of Americans, they're trying to figure out ways to understand Taiwan. Taiwan has suddenly risen to the public consciousness in a way that it has not for decades. I mean, Taiwan is historically, if you look at the pattern of it, one of these right-wing dictatorships that was propped up by the US for the interests of anti-communism. This was Chiang Kai-shek and his son, Jiang Jingguo. But then after that, in the decades since, out of the democracy movement, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, emerged out of that, along with other parties or activists and organizations and so forth. And so then the DPP was able to take power in 2000 as the first time in its history that could take power. This was more or less an accident. It happened because the KMT did not have a strong candidate. It had two candidates that were fighting over the nomination, and that created internal splits. So it took power more or less by accident then. It was only until 2016 that the KMT did not hold the majority in the Taiwanese legislature. Taiwan's democratization has the strange process by which the former authoritarian party was eventually pushed to allow for elections, but it still existed after the transition to democracy, competed in elections, and could actually win elections, having more resources than the Democratic Progressive Party. And the Democratic Progressive Party is, the DPP, is historically pro-independence, but for reasons I'll get into a bit later, it has backed away from that stance under Tsai Ing-wen in the past decade and so forth. But the KMT was historically backed by the US for the interests of anti-communism to oppose China. However, as time goes on with the economic development of China and the opening up, the KMT's motivations changes. It no longer prioritizes going back to China and taking control away from the CCP and retaking China in that sense. The second generation leadership of the KMT after it came to Taiwan, what they prioritize is more or less just the cultural unification of Taiwan and China.
I think Jim got knocked off.
Well, we'll continue. Let's continue until he comes back.
All right.
So you played that, well, Alex. What's your comment on it?
Well, it's interesting to hear the both of them. It's I mean, there are. We didn't get the second guy. I don't think he got into the meat of his argument. I mean, and I've heard a bunch of other, well, obviously, with so much interest in Taiwan, and just having an interest in Taiwan, having Taiwanese American friends and so on, and being interested in the whole military situation between us and China. Of course, done some reading and some listening to like podcasts about the history of Taiwan. And one of the things they didn't mention is that a big part of it's a Democratic People's Party. That's the one that's sort of, well, they're the one who are more pro-independence, although, again, officially they can't, Taiwan's going to get attacked if they ever say, oh, we're declaring ourselves an independent country now. We're just Taiwan. No, China doesn't. We're not part of China. But a lot of it has more to do with kind of resistance to the KMT historically, because the DPP kind of emerged Actually, somewhat from the Taiwanese. Well, the Taiwanese left was destroyed, just like in Korea, by the very harsh not just anti-communist, but anti-left persecution of, basically, Taiwan had its own white terror in the 50s and 60s, where again, hundreds, thousands of alleged communists were arrested, thrown in jail. Some were just murdered. And so again, there's never been a strong, left in Taiwan because of that anti-communist legacy. And from what I've heard from other kind of, some leftist Taiwanese, that a lot of with the DPP again, it's kind of identity politics. In the KMT, since they were basically Chinese from the mainland, they were seen as imposing themselves on the native Taiwanese population, which is is even more divided. Again, they're there's the indigenous Taiwanese who have been there for like more than 1,000 years. Then there's another group of immigrants from say 400 to 500 years before now that are basically Chinese from the mainland who moved in. Then there are again the KMT people who came in after 1949 and ran the country, the very oppressive state, power for a long time. And so the DPP formed to basically resist the KMT and its repressive, generally repressive political system. So, but that over time, as I understand it, that basically became that their hatred for the KMT, because again the KMT was from the mainland, they were like Chinese versus the Taiwanese who believed they were indigenous, essentially, that kind of morphed into a belief that any Chinese from the mainland were like the enemy. So it then shifted again to also the PRC, again the Chinese communists, also being the enemy of the DPP. So there's a lot of that also, and
Okay.
yeah,
It sounds like you're talking about the arguments between my aunts and uncles.
it kind of is, yeah.
I know Jim's back, but I just want to ask Victor a question.
Yeah.
Victor,
Yes.
what's the answer?
Oh God, you for the answer to that? No, I have to say I'm learning a lot in this discussion. I mean, the actual chronology of all that with Taiwan, I was not completely aware of. It's not an area I've studied in detail. I would like to think, I suppose, and this is not really can't be raised to the level of a proposal because I don't know enough about the surrounding conditions. I would like to think that there can be some kind of negotiated solution between the Chinese and the Taiwanese, where ideally there would be some kind of autonomous territory or something like that. I don't know. You see, the thing is, I was trying to compare it to the U.S. and Puerto Rico because the Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony. It's legally considered by the U.S. to be part of the U.S. and its inhabitants are U.S. citizens, and yet its people have a distinct culture and are separate from the United States, but the difference is that there is nonetheless a difference between the kinds of system that the U.S. and China have, and I would think that the Chinese People's Republic might be more prepared in terms of the nature of its system to have a non-exploitative relationship with an associated territory that would be different from the purely colonial relationship that the U.S. has with Puerto Rico. So these are just some thoughts. I mean, it's just my sort of ramblings about speculations about possibilities, but I certainly can't claim to have a solution.
Yeah, we're gonna have next week on Tuesday, Bruce, who you were just beginning to hear, and then the wonderful world of Zoom faded out. But we're going to have him talking about this from Taiwan because I found his perspective quite interesting to listen to because he was giving a different perspective than I normally hear about Taiwan.
Was he the second speaker just now?
He was the second speaker, the younger gentleman talking, and we're going to have him on from Taiwan at 8:30. It's one of the advantages of doing this at 8:30 in the evening, is it turns out it's 8:30 in the morning in Taiwan.
Yeah.
So, so I figured he'd be interesting for us to talk to at great length, and I'd want him to go into greater detail about the domestic politics in Taiwan, because it's a very, I guess the gist of it is that for many on the left, his arguments were very different than what we normally hear, because we tend not to hear about the sort of rebellion against the KMT that occurred inside Taiwan and then led to an election of a government that essentially is the one where today, I guess, the president or is the president or the prime minister of the Republic of China? I don't, Alex, you're muted.
President.
President. Yeah, she actually made a comment about the question of China and there's all sorts of ways to interpret, because I wanted to show those actual radar patterns, because a lot of the bullshit we hear in the press is frankly erroneous. It just is, it's warmongering, frankly. I mean, I don't use that term lightly. I don't deploy that term lightly. But I think one could see factually that you have an aggressive opposing geopolitical entity against a much, much larger geopolitical entity, and you have the active involvement and desire of the United States and its allies to essentially compress the expression of military power outside of China. And the Chinese, of course, have an expansionary vision. They've been arguing since the 1980s in some of their strategic arguments to expand their military political influence far out and kick the United States out of Asia completely. And so that's been a debate going on for quite a long time. And now, of course, we're seeing in the crunch of it, given China's rise in economic power, the actual manifestation of it. Because and another thing that's not brought into the arguments with this rush to rearm is that sensible critiques of the spending of the U.S. naval budget for the past 30 years show that they basically fucked up from their own perspective. They invested in classes of vessels that turned out not to be effective. So there was this whole big expansion of spending in the Navy after the Gulf War to create what they called littoral combat ships. They built about 30 of them. Well, it turns out that those ships can't even function or maintain well. The issue of spending lots of money on, they just started launching the Ford aircraft carrier, which went through all sorts of different problems. Even from the point of view of, quote, the liberal, defense people, they had serious misspending of money. And then, of course, you have this final question of their investments in aircraft, and the F-35, of course, is a good example of it. So what's dangerous in that is that it sort of reinforces the conservative trends in the defense military industrial complex in our country to say, oh my God, we're way behind them. Now we have to really spend up and ramp up. And the Chinese, of course, are doing the same. They're building every 4 years the equivalent of the entire tonnage of the Royal Navy. So it's a dangerous situation. And I think I wasn't able to play Michael Clare. Michael basically said that the U.S. should decide not to go in between the Taiwan Straits. But I think it's a deeper thing, and especially with this global climate change going on. And I think you raised a very good point earlier, Victor, about the issue of all these expenditures into defense spending in the midst of essentially the entire environment of the world collapsing is absurd.
Okay, hey, Jim, I got two questions. When is the guy going to be on our show?
He's going to be on Tuesday. He's going to come on to a Zoom call on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. And then that means Wednesday, he'll basically be coming on Tuesday night.
Okay, I wanted to make a comment on the thing about Taiwan. Because that was in the news recently. Okay, let Michael go. Go ahead, Michael.
No, I didn't want to cut you off. I just said I wanted to get a comment in there also.
Oh, okay. So I was thinking, because there was a report that China, mainland China was very upset about US statements about having oversight troops, any kind of a military presence on the ground in Taiwan. And it reminded me of 1963 and Cuba. Okay, Cuba, it's a communist country right off our shores. You could swim from Cuba to Hawaii, to the Keys, I guess. And so Kennedy said, no missiles in Cuba from the Russians. And it blockaded the whole place. So getting a similar reaction from mainland China about Taiwan, we never claimed ownership of Cuba. I don't know whether or not Teddy Roosevelt ever had control of Cuba and gave it back or gave it independence. I really don't know in history. But the point is, at that time, we didn't consider we owned Cuba, just the base on the, where we got, where we had.
Not technically, but there are things like, Jim, what's
but
the clause? There's a clause in one treaty that from the Spanish American War that gives us permission to invade Cuba whenever we wanted. Platt Amendment, that's right.
But in any event, so the U.S. government headed by Jack Kennedy said, nope, back off, surround the island. That's it, get your missiles out of here. So you can understand that Taiwan could at least pretend to have that kind of an attitude also, because they can point to our action in that. Now, I do have an answer, and it's commerce. There's China, the government, through its capitalist system of taking like 51% ownership on private enterprises, and then having an individual private citizen do something, but the government owns 51% of it. They're buying, port of entry, docking facilities all through Long Beach. They're buying farms in the middle of the country. They're in competition with Bill Gates trying to get farmland. They're buying territory here in the US. And I think that the percentage of the population, I know the percentage of Asian or Chinese population is very high in certain areas, like San Gabriel, close to LA, but also San Francisco and so forth. But I believe, I just couldn't get it, look up. They're coming up to double digits in terms of the percentage of US population. And there's a tremendous amount of intermarriage. So the point is, if there's commerce, also, I think a major aspect of the rise of China is due to America. It's Nixon. Nixon got them into being accepted into the World Trade Association. He pushed for that. And they've been selling us stuff ever since. We're the biggest customer. And that's also benefited us as individuals, because you can buy a 55-inch high-def TV for $350 because of that. A cell phone, an iPhone would cost, if it was made in the States, would cost about $2,200. So, they're still making money. You can get it for $1,000 or $800. But the cheap labor in China has led to an enhancement, an actual on-the-ground enhancement of the quality of life in the US and other countries, other first world countries.
Well, okay.
So the point is, the only thing I'm saying is, it's like the old thing where there's a treaty between two opposing dukes in Italy or Germany. They'll say, well, we got a peace treaty, so send over your cousin and your wife and your daughter. They're going to live with us, and I'll send over my cousin and wife. He'll live with you. So that's to prevent, maintain the don't attack, because it's not in your interest to attack. It's not in China's interest to attack us or us to attack them. That's the answer.
Well,
there's got to be trade and coexistence.
All right. Well, that's been the dominance of policy ever since Nixon, and Kissinger did the opening to China. I mean, that's been the part of the equation for the past 50 years. And and whether it's going to work or not down the road is partly what we're trying to understand. But I know, Michael. I know we're running. Let me just start. Let me just bring Gail in quickly
Yeah.
and Dennis on this. Gail, your comments about this? Gail, Dennis, your comments about this? Gail, go on. About China. Are you there, Gail?
Oh, it'll be pretty interesting if we get into some military conflict, because think of all those little kiddies up at Columbia University getting degrees. They're all children of the Communist Party, as a friend who's Chinese has told me. So, they're pretty integrated with us, whether they want to admit it or not. I guess they could all go scurrying home.
Well, that's the absurdity of it. See, that's the absurdity of it because, as you know, we're talking about someone who is actually, I think Gail was referring to someone who's a medieval scholar at Columbia, who's a student who came in from China, came in from Manchuria, in fact. His family lives close to the Korean border. But the Columbia of today is very different than the Columbia of, let's say, when Victor was there, or even when I was there, or Gail was there. It's there are a large percentage of Asian Americans and Chinese from Taiwan and the mainland going to school there.
Many mainland students.
Right, and they have their own
And
little
they're
division.
party children. Their parents are in the party.
Right, but what's also
Sucking up what they can learn.
it's also clear, yeah. But also, I've in terms of I've been in classes where some of these Chinese students are there, and they're always terrific. They're always great, and they question and think out loud about all this. They don't, they're all over the place politically about it. So I would never want to stereotype or generalize about their opinions about their own country because it's just in my experience they're thoughtful and intelligent and critical and thinking about what's going on. Again, that's only a very insignificant percentage of people. You can't judge from that. But these issues are hotly debated. Anyway, Dennis, your comments about China right now. Dennis, you have to unmute. Dennis? All right, Dennis is unmuting. Michael.
I'm unmuted.
Go on, Dennis.
Okay. I think the problem is the people who have captured our foreign policy. And that is the real problem because we are the aggressor, as far as I'm concerned. And if the American people don't do something about who are making the policy, this is supposed to be a democracy, but it turns out that it isn't. And it turns out that most people are powerless around policy issues, especially foreign policy. And we have to do something. I would say we should take an anti-imperialist stance, and we should mobilize. And we should at least get up to the level we were the anti-Vietnam War. We should really be against the Chinese war and a Russian war too, because it's both countries are in the, I would say, the gun sights of the U.S. military-industrial complex. And this would be, I think, the neoconservatives that are mainly in control. And that is a problem, especially since the U.S. is not doing well internationally in terms of its imperialism. I mean, we lost the Afghan war, similar to the way we lost the Vietnam War. This is like a period of about 50 years, and we have not won a war since. And maybe before that, we didn't win the Korean War either. That was a stalemate. And the question is, why are these people getting all that money for all these losing events, which are making some people millionaires and billionaires? I mean, it's crazy. It's really crazy. And it's scary because what we're neglecting is global warming. And that's a big problem. And so we I will say it again and again. We as a people need to mobilize, and we need a revolutionary party, and we need a movement of movements, and we need a new international working and oppressed peoples, like from the center of imperialism to the peripheries. We have to organize all the what do you call it? All the rebellions that are happening all over the world, and bring them together because we are the majority, and the majority isn't the people who control the policy, and we need to get our point of view manifested materially. That's what we need to do, and that's what I think. I'll just leave it at that.
All right. See, I think in listening to this, I think what's going to happen in Glasgow in the next 2 weeks is going to be quite telling because, frankly, if we're talking about some sort of movement of movements, well, the movement of movements of humanity's destruction of the climate, I think, transcends everything. And, it's going to be interesting to see the politics of what transpires in Scotland in the next 2 weeks. But, Michael, your comments. Mike?
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. First of all, I did notice a couple of things in the first speaker's little assessment of the situation. He made an interesting comment that unfortunately I've heard before, made in different ways, but using the same type of phraseology. When he said that Chiang Kai-shek and his followers fled to Taiwan. In other words, Chiang Kai-shek and a few thousand of his followers fled to Taiwan, and that they were going to liberate, that the People's Republic was trying to liberate those Chinese who fled to Taiwan. How do you liberate somebody who is fleeing from you? This is the whole thing. This is the abuse of the word liberation. And it means that it indicates a propagandistic attitude towards the assessment. Made a couple of other slip-ups like that. So just from a journalistic point of view, it makes me suspicious of that assessment, of his assessment. And of course, the second chap we'll have on next week, so we'll be able to hear him in more detail. I think that just because the United States is an aggressor doesn't mean that no other country is an aggressor. The problem in Taiwan and the damage that really was done because obviously the dictatorship that was ruling Taiwan for all these decades is no longer there, but I don't think that it seems like the People's Republic really couldn't care less whether it's a dictatorship or whoever's in charge. They basically want a reunification and they want control over Taiwan, and that's basically it. The problem is, if there was if Taiwan became an autonomous zone, shall we say, China, the People's Republic of China, has already blown that with Hong Kong. In other words, after seeing what happened in Hong Kong, nobody in Taiwan, well, I don't want to say nobody, but in my opinion, in my assessment, the overwhelming majority of the people of Taiwan are not going to trust the People's Republic of China if they say, well, we'll give you a certain amount of autonomy. So basically, we have a stalemate. I don't think it would be very foolish of them to try military action against Taiwan. Not that it wouldn't be successful, but it would be costly more than it would be worth, I think, in the long run for People's Republic. So I think what's happening here is basically a stalemate. The United States and Great Britain and Australia and France and whomever really doesn't have to get directly involved if there was a military action between the People's Republic and Taiwan.
Well,
Simply, in other words, yes, if they want to keep Taiwanese total independence, but if they want to do damage to the People's Republic of China, they could basically just give, basically secondhand support as much as possible to Taiwan, and make Taiwan, a short-term version for China of what Vietnam was for the United States.
well,
Except in the long run, I don't think I think the end result would be different. But even so, it would be
a little
all right.
different,
Let me
Mike.
all right. Let me totally disagree with you, Michael, and I'm going to shift it to Victor to have the last comments. Victor already left, I
Well,
think.
before you disagree with me, let
Yeah,
me just get one point in. Jim, you're wrong about littoral class ships, U.S. Navy ships, being useless. The Circle Line is going to need to replace its boats around Manhattan.
all right.
They'll be
All right.
very
Well,
useful.
I think Victor left, unfortunately, because I was going to
Maybe,
let
because
me.
Gail hasn't said anything for a while, so
No,
maybe
Gail
she has thoughts on Taiwan.
Well,
all right.
Don't denude what Gail just said. She made some good points.
I'm saying goodbye.
All right.
It's way after 11.
Goodbye, Gail.
Goodbye, Gail.
All right. All right. Well, anyway, I would argue that first of all, to the question of liberation, non-liberation, uh, we forget that the Afghanistan, in comparison to China, the defeat of the Kuomintang by the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, is frankly tiddlywinks compared to that, as being an earthquake in how America viewed its post-war policy after World War II, because we intended to essentially control Asia with our partnership with the Kuomintang, and that collapsed and went out the door. So, I've been looking very carefully at, because I was so intrigued by this Chinese movie on the Battle of Chosin Reservoir being the highest grosser of all time so far this year of any movie. Why? And, if you look at the time when we were reacting to the invasion of the South by the DPRK, which now evidence shows was a very cleverly organized event by Kim Il-sung, carefully exploiting Stalin and Mao, and essentially competing them and throwing them out. And basically, the DPRK had essentially controlled or purged the elements of the Korean Communist Party that were leaning towards China. And the invasion itself in 1950 was, some scholars in the evidence, they look on it as Stalin's last great hurrah, because he took a personal interest in making sure that the Korean People's Army was well equipped, and he had advisors down to battalion level in the KPA in 1950, because they were assuming, and they essentially did pull it off, that they would conquer Korea in 6 weeks, except they were, of course, caught flat-footed when the United States intervened. Now, in the case of China, what's also forgotten in that period of time is that in the United States itself, the Rosenberg case escalates. The Rosenbergs are arrested during the summer of 1950, and there is just this massive repression, similar to what was going on, I might add, in China. China was going through a counter-revolutionary campaign, if you will, that was mounted at the same time by Mao, as they were preparing to early on support the KPA, because they began to shift their troops from invading Taiwan to move them into the Manchuria as early as July of 1950. All right, so they were already thinking that it might not work out that well, and they wouldn't have a backup to go intervene into Korea if they had to, and they did. We know that they did. But also in the United States, the most vicious, incredible attacks on desegregation, segregation, the KKK having mass meetings. I mean, it's something that usually when we think about this period of the Cold War, we don't necessarily equate, but on a daily basis in the South, you know, outright, in some cases, firefights with African American citizen groups in local parts of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama. I mean, all throughout the same time. At the same time, the McCarthy period is going on steroids. The whole suppression of Hollywood is escalating, and so, now how do we make analogies with this time? I don't know. I would certainly say that we're in a period of time where that's occurring too in the United States, except, who are the new communists? Who are the new, quote, who are the witches that we're going after? Well, I guess, immigrants from other parts of the world coming here because of the collapse of the climate to support them and the economies around the world. So it's a really tense, crazy time we're living in. But in any event, Victor left, and I wanted to actually play this for him because he mentioned to me how much he enjoyed Phil Oakes, and I thought it'd be a sort of interesting way to go out. Love Me, I'm a Liberal. I remember that was
good song.
That's one of the few songs of Phil Oakes I always got a kick out of because I was too much interested in rock and roll. But this one I always enjoyed because I sort of was so. I was always
expand it expand it.
All right. Let's hear what Phil Oakes has to say.
It's a political opinion. One of the shadiest of these is the Liberals. An outspoken group on many subjects. 10 degrees to the left of center in good times. 10 degrees to the right of center if it affects them personally. So here then is a lesson in safe logic. I cried when they shot Medgar Evers. Tears ran down my spine. And I cried when they shot Mr. Kennedy, as though I'd lost a father of mine. But Malcolm X got what was coming. He got what he asked for this time. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Get it? I go to civil rights rallies and I put down the old DAR. DAR, that's the dykes of the American Revolution. I love Harry and Sidney and Sammy. I hope every colored boy becomes a star. But don't talk about revolution. That's going a little bit too far. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I cheered when Humphrey was chosen, my faith in the system restored. And I'm glad that the commies were thrown out from the AFL-CIO board. And I love Puerto Ricans and Negroes, as long as they don't move next door. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Ah, the people of old Mississippi should all hang their heads in shame. Now I can't understand how their minds work. What's the matter, don't they watch less Crane? But if you ask me to bus my children, I hope the cops take down your name. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Yes, I read New Republic and Nation. I've learned to take every view. You know, I've memorized Lerner and Golden. I feel like I'm almost a Jew. But when it comes to times like Korea, there's no one more red, white, and blue. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I vote for the Democratic Party. They want the UN to be strong. I attend all the Pete Seeger concerts. He sure gets me singing those songs. And I'll send all the money you ask for, but don't ask me to come on along. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Sure, once I was young and impulsive, I wore every conceivable pin, even went to socialist meetings, learned all the old Union hymns. But I've grown older and wiser, and that's why I'm turning you in. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal.
All right, and we've been joined tonight with Victor Wallis, Alex Stavropoulos, Dennis Goldstein, Ken Aaron, Gail Aronow, Michael Jankowitz, myself, Jim Dingeman. I want to thank you all for listening. The October 29th edition of Going Viral at GoingViral.news. Good night.